Just Another Monster contains adult themes, violence, and content that may be sensitive to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Just Another Monster.
This is Season 1, Episode 6 of Just Another Monster. The show where we shed light on the monsters that live among us. First, I wanted to say thank you to my listeners. Thank you for subscribing and listening to the show. You are the reason I do this. Now, with so many of you becoming fans of the show, I feel like I need to refer to you as something more appropriate. How about the Monster Squad? No. Or maybe the Monster Mob. Speaking of listeners, I need your help. Right now, I am running the show ad-free. Now, I want my listeners to be able to listen to Just Another Monster uninterrupted, but it takes a lot of time and investment to make these shows. So if you want to help, tell your friends about the show. Share it on your Facebook page or your Instagram or your TikTok. And you can tag me using the hashtag MonstersAreReal. I appreciate you all. Thank you. And now, on with the show. You ever had that one teacher in school that seemed kind and genuine but seemed to be hiding something sinister behind their grin? Or how about a talented friend who suffered something so debilitating that it kept them from reaching their true potential? Well, on this episode, I will be telling the story of two monsters. One monster who was revered by his peers, his colleagues, and his students while holding a very dark and very disturbing secret. And the other, a victim of this monster, who had to become a monster himself and able to face his own demon. It's a tragic story of a monster who took advantage of his position to commit horrible and disgusting acts. And this gave rise to a whole new breed of monster. Now, if you haven't noticed yet, there's a bit of an underlying theme with most of the episodes I've done for season 1 of this show so far. I've had some personal connection to most of the cases I've covered. This case is no different. This is yet another story that I have a personal connection to, and we will get to that soon enough. So, let's get on with it, shall we? Sit back, relax, and let me tell you a story. A story of just another monster. To tell this story, I feel I need to sort of set the stage. I had to go back and dig through my own childhood memories and recall a different time. Take myself to a different place. a place where my own innocence still resides. And that place is Ballard, Washington. Tucked away along the coastal regions of Shoal and Salmon Bays, it's a sprawling suburb of Seattle's downtown region. It's largely made up of homes built in the late 1800s to the early 1900s and peppered with little mom-and-pop gift shops and butchers in between. While a suburb of Seattle's metropolitan area, in the 80s and 90s, Ballard still saw itself as a bit of a small town. The community was close-knit in this little Scandinavian fishing town. It's known for its annual seafood fest. People would gather around and listen to local Scandinavian folk rock bands while stuffing their faces with chowder bowls and IPAs. The town even has its own May parade to celebrate 17. Mai, Norway's Constitution Day. I'm probably butchering that, but I'm not Scandinavian. Historically, Ballard is considered the city's center of Seattle's ethnically Scandinavian seafaring community. Lots of boats, lots of fish, and you guessed it, lots of Scandinavians. Since the 2000s, Ballard has become a trendy waterfront neighborhood, full of hip new restaurants, bars, indie specialty shops, and craft breweries, of course. I mean, it is Seattle after all. We are known for our coffee, our rain, grunge music, crippling depression, and of course, our craft beers. I grew up in Ballard in the 80s and 90s, and it was a very different place then. Old craft stores and other local businesses have since been replaced by overpriced condos and apartment dwellings. Today, it's a haven for trendy Silicon Valley transplants and techie hipsters that only drink conflict-free, shade-grown coffee. Nowadays, you can't even really tell where the town of Ballard ends and where the city of Seattle begins. They just kind of overlap now. Back in the 80s, it really was kind of a small town. A picturesque suburb that only had one movie theater. Seriously, just one. And it would play the same damn Disney movie multiple times a day for 6 months straight. I feel very passionate about this. In fact, it was the kind of movie theater that had the old neon marquee out front and the exterior ticket booth, the kind you'd see in period films. It even had something called cry rooms. You would never see these in movie theaters anymore. A cry room is a small space, usually on the upper floor of an older cinema. It would contain about 4 to 6 seats and would be encased in glass. It would have a speaker that would pump in audio from the movie into a small room. It was specifically designed for people to take their babies or small children up for some privacy or to reduce the disturbance to other theater goers. One of my very first jobs as a teenager was working at the deteriorating Majestic Bay Theater. This theater was very old and very small, and working the concession stand was a nightmare. You could hear the entire movie while it played. I can still recite The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast word for word to this day, and I hate myself for it. Imagine having to listen to that movie playing over and over 5 times a day, nearly every day for 6 months. Actually, come to think of it, I imagine it's similar to what it would be like raising a child. I couldn't imagine having to listen to Teletubbies 24/7. I don't even know if that's a thing anymore. Growing up in Ballard was kind of like living in a Spielberg film. I was having a conversation the other day with an old friend I grew up with in Ballard, and he made the comment that the town was similar to the one portrayed in the film Super 8. He pretty much nailed it with that description. Back then, most of us were pretty much free-range kids. All the kids and parents knew each other, and most of us were friends. We would all go down to Golden Gardens and hang out on the beach, or sneak out onto the bluffs and play on the rope swing that some teenagers erected 20 years earlier. I'm surprised we didn't die on that thing. We'd ride our bikes or skateboards for miles around town without a care or worry in the world. We'd hear the old familiar chime of Joe's ice cream truck as it paced down each block. We even had our own hangout spots. We'd all hit the local burger joint after school, Dick's Drive-In. We'd meet up for an ice cream cone or a burger before parting ways. Oh, there's nothing better than a nice warm bag of Dick's burgers. Sorry, I had to. It's just too easy. Now, many of us who lived near each other as kids would walk to school together every morning or back home after school. Now, I lived just a couple of blocks from Loyal Heights Elementary, where I attended the 6th grade. In 1986, I attended my first year at Whitman Middle School, which was located in the Crown Hill area, which is about 2 miles from where I lived. Now, many of the kids who attended Loyal Heights Elementary went on to Whitman Middle and then off to Ballard High School. Now, if you remember Ballard High School, that's the school I was going to when I covered the very first episode of this season, The Mayflower Killer. Ballard kind of functioned as a small town. It's similar to what you'd expect in a small town in middle of nowhere USA, but we were a suburb of Seattle. It was at Whitman Middle School that I met my new best friend, Justin Maltos. We both joined the Ballard Blackjack soccer team. It is also where I met Mr. Summers. He taught U.S. history and geography and was a favorite of many students and staff at the school. Mr. Summers, or Neal, was the youngest of 3 brothers. At the early age of 4, Neal Summers witnessed his mother deteriorate from cancer. Just a few weeks after Neal's 5th Christmas, his mother, Beulah Summers, had succumbed to the cancer. In 1953, after his mother's death, Neal was sent off to live in a nearby home of a family friend. Neal's older brothers were already in school, and Neal's father felt he could not provide the kind of life Neal needed at the time. Neal was described as a cheerful kid who would later develop the passion for teaching. Now, his parents were both teachers and had met in Anacortes during the Great Depression in the 1930s. The family held strong values and commitment when it came to teaching and learning, so it was only natural that Neal would follow the same path. In 1955, Neal's father, Lyle Summers, had remarried. Neal then moved back in with his father and stepmother Jean into their home in the Wallingford area of Seattle. Neal's new stepmother was also a teacher herself. Now, Neal wasn't known for his athleticism. His 2 older brothers, who would all later become teachers themselves, were more athletes. They were into sports like basketball and baseball. Instead, Neal preferred being outdoors. He enjoyed hiking, fishing, and camping, and he would later share these passions with his younger students, handing down basic survival and hunting skills. While attending Hamilton Middle School, which was just a few blocks away from where Neal Summers had been living, he was described as a bit of a wallflower, a bit of an outsider, quiet but friendly, and a bit bookish. He was someone who applied himself to his studies and was active in a lot of student committees. After high school, Neal headed off to the University of Washington in 1972, where he would earn his bachelor's in geography. Neal followed in his father's footsteps and became active in his community. Even as a neighbor, he was known to regularly help an elderly woman park her car, and he ran errands for many others. As for his personal life, Neal wasn't much of a dater. At his 10-year high school reunion, he listed himself as single and will probably remain that way. He listed his hobbies as camping, hiking, and working with youth groups. After attending the University of Washington, he eventually moved on to take a few courses at Western Washington University. He eventually did a few short teaching jobs here and there, and in time would earn his teaching certification in 1978. Neal Summers eventually joined the staff full-time at Whitman Middle School in 1979. The same year that Neal Summers joined Whitman Middle School as Mr. Summers, there was a 9-year-old boy named Darrell Cloud, and he was about to become a very important figure in Neal Summers' life. Darrell Cloud was a victim of circumstances. Now, I don't subscribe to the victim mentality, but often there are people who are born into just really shitty circumstances, and they're at the mercy of everyone else's best or poorest efforts. I can relate to that personally. Daryl wasn't much different in this case. At age 9, Daryl learned that he was adopted by William and Ingrid Cloud. A week after learning this, his father left to serve a year in prison for mail fraud. This would be a particularly defining event for Daryl and the path his life would follow. In the months to come, his mother had informed a psychologist that Daryl would fly into fits of rage over the smallest things. He would destroy his toys, rip his bed apart, even smashed his own bedroom door in. He had run away from home on 3 separate occasions and even attempted suicide twice. School officials would report that he would behave erratically and impulsively. This became a serious enough issue for William Cloud, enough to ask the court for an early release so that he can help with the issues that were happening back home. In support of the appeal, the family psychologist Eileen McCarty had interviewed Daryl and had determined that he was an extremely sensitive child and that learning he was adopted had caused significant and substantial trauma for the boy. She went on to state that Daryl had deep feelings of doubt and mistrust. This was coupled with his newly perceived lack of identity and feelings of early rejection. Then there were the feelings of abandonment when his father left for prison a week earlier. McCarty said Darrell Cloud avoided talking about his feelings with her.
I am concerned with the bearing of feelings because they will surface just as explosively when he's confronted with another crisis.
Eventually, Darrell Allen Cloud would find a bit of a father figure in Neal Summers, but we'll get to that soon enough. Just about a mile away from Darrell Cloud's elementary school, Mr. Summers was settling in at Whitman Middle School. In 1984, Mr. Summers had taken on the role as the 8th grade party chairman, where he coordinated chocolate bar sales to help fund the event. He promised an assembly, special luncheon, a dance in the gym, refreshments, flowers, balloons, and other special surprises. This was his commitment in the Whitman Whispers, to the school's newsletter. It's safe to say that Mr. Summers had become a favorite amongst students. He stood about 5'7", around 240 pounds, and he enjoyed the nickname Buddha, something he picked up as a nickname while on a field trip to Hawaii. He even had a license plate frame that said Buddha's Blue Bomber. He was seen as a dedicated and caring teacher with a commitment to young children that went beyond the school's hallways. This has been an interesting case for me to cover. Like the many I've done preceding this one, I have ties to this case in one way or another. Aside from the fact that I attended Whitman Middle School and even had Mr. Summers as a geography teacher, researching this case brought up some old quotes from people I was friends with as a kid. For instance, Matt Diefenbach. He was 18 at the time when he was quoted in the Seattle Times back in 1994, stating that Mr. Summers had a prankish sense of humor. I knew him more as a disciplinarian myself, as I did with most of my teachers. I was not the most attentive or obedient student, a common thing among many kids with undiagnosed ADHD. I was always getting into trouble and basically skipping class. I knew Matt. In fact, I grew up with him as a kid. He lived just a couple of blocks away from me in Ballard. We had attended Loyal Heights Elementary together and then Whitman Middle School. We'd spend the summers at each other's houses playing laser tag, or we would play fight to USA Network's Kung Fu Theater. We both ended up at Ballard High School as well, but we grew apart as we found our own cliques or groups to hang out with, just as kids do when they get into high school. It's a bit surreal and nostalgic looking back on that. In fact, I think he was friends with the family that bought my old house I grew up in. It's a small world. After living in an apartment in the Sandpoint region of Seattle, Mr. Summers eventually bought a home on 32nd Avenue Northeast, about 5 miles east of Whitman Middle School. His home would later become a safe space for a regular stream of young visitors. More on that later. As I had mentioned earlier, Mr. Summers was an avid outdoorsman. He loved fishing, hiking, and camping. He would go on to plan school camping trips where he would hand down some of those skills to young students. Sometimes, he would even have camping trips at a cabin he owned in the San Juan Islands. Parents and teachers saw Mr. Summers as someone who had a lot of energy, someone who was an active participant and had the willingness to get things done. Students remembered him for his unique style and demeanor. He was also known as a hefty disciplinarian who had no problems handing down detention to rowdy and unmanageable students. And don't think for a second that Mr. Summers' relationships with young students didn't go unnoticed. One ex-student had told the Seattle Times that they remember students that were angry with Mr. Summers' disciplinary actions would taunt him by yelling "pervert" down the hallways. Clearly, some of the students were aware of something much more nefarious about Mr. Summers, something that would shake students, faculty, and parents to their core. Mr. Summers had a bit of a reputation among some students who attended Whitman in the early 1980s. This was something that was unknown amongst the faculty of Whitman Middle School and the parents of the students that attended. Mr. Summers, a single man, would invite teenage boys to his home off of 32nd Avenue Northeast. It was a place where teenage boys and some junior high students knew they can go to play pool and drink beer after school and during the summer. Mr. Summers had actually supplied the beer. It was kept very low-key, and the young boys didn't want to get Mr. Summers into trouble. Doing so would mean they would also likely get busted and lose out on their clubhouse. Darrell Cloud would become a regular attendee at these private gatherings at Mr. Summers' home. Darrell started to attend Whitman Middle School, and it's there that he has started to get to know Mr. Summers. Darrell eventually became a TA, or teacher's aide, for Mr. Summers. He would help with distributing assignments and taking attendance and other classroom duties. A woman who was asked that her name not be used spoke with the Seattle Times about Darrell's relationship with Mr. Summers. She had considered herself Darrell's girlfriend in the 8th grade, and she had known Darrell since he was about 6 or 7 years old. She had stated there was much more to the parent-teacher relationship between Mr. Summers and Darrell Cloud. Darrell had told her that Mr. Summers had made some sort of sexual advance toward him.
I heard the guys talking about it, how Daryl hit Mr. Summers. That's when he said he made a pass at me. Daryl was even kind of hostile about it.
This is when she noticed a change in the 14-year-old Darrell.
I know when his temperament started changing after the 8th grade. That's when it all started.
A former classmate of Darrell's, Mark Marquardt, recalls how boys used to wonder and joke about the sexuality of their former junior high teacher.
Maybe people would make jokes about it, about, Mr. Summers being queer and all. And you could tell it didn't really sit right with Darrell.
Marquardt said.
It wasn't that he took offense to it, but he just didn't join in either.
Throughout high school and into college, there seemed to be two versions of Darrell Cloud. The extremely capable and celebrated athlete, and the kid with an explosive and impulsive temper. After Whitman, Darrell moved to North Seattle's Ingram High School. During his junior year of high school, Darrell was the star quarterback of the Ingram Rams varsity football team. In 1985, during a close game with Blanchette High School, Darrell was tackled in the end zone for a safety with just a little over a minute left to play in the game. Yikes. The final score was Blanchette 9, Ingram 6. As Darrell left the field, he visibly flipped off the Blanchette crowd, and he was benched as a result. Not long after this, Darrell lost his temper during a junior varsity basketball team, and he was ejected as a result. As he left the gym, he punched his fist through the school's front door. He was then suspended. Darrell and his family eventually moved to Kirkland, Washington in fall of 1986, and Darrell enrolled in Juanita High School. It was there that Darrell became quarterback for the Juanita Rebels. With them, they had won 2 King Bowl championships and led the Rebels to their 3rd straight state title game. Unfortunately, Juanita lost that game to Gonzaga in a crushing 14-7 defeat. Darrell eventually graduated from Juanita High School and enrolled in Washington State University, where he left during his first year as a freshman. He later went on to the Green River Community College, where he played baseball, and then he enlisted at the University of Washington as a junior with an athletic scholarship in 1990. Coach Bob McDonald recalls Darrell's athleticism as nothing short of spectacular. It was then that Darrell married Jennifer Lynn Halverson, a girl he had known since high school. Unfortunately, Darrell's temperament impacted his marriage life as well. Shortly after their marriage, things started to turn around, for the worse. During an altercation with his then wife, Darrell had threatened her with a baseball bat and a gun. Now, the young woman's parents urged Jennifer to end the marriage, which she did in 1992 when she filed for a dissolution and requested a court-mandated no-contact order against Darrell Cloud. She stated that he had problems controlling his anger and had threatened suicide on more than one occasion. This would be the beginning of Darrell's downward spiral. It was shortly after Darrell's marriage was dissolved that Coach Bob McDonald kicked Darrell off of the Husky baseball team for repeatedly violating his curfew. Daryl then dropped out of college without graduating. Daryl's anger and temper likely translated well for his incredible athleticism. It was an outlet for whatever underlying issues Daryl had. Unfortunately, his impulsive and unhinged outbursts would be his demise. Daryl later moved into a mother-in-law apartment of a home his father had rented to another tenant in White Center. Daryl took up work as a contractor for his father. It was around this time that Daryl also started to collect weapons, such as handguns and rifles. He had purchased a handgun via mail order and even a bow and arrow. He also owned a .45 caliber handgun, a shotgun, and even an AR-15. Many of these were later purchased after he received a court order stating that he could not legally possess any weapons. This came after he was cited in 1992 for displaying a weapon to intimidate, after a motorist reported he had been waving a pistol around inside of his car on Interstate 5, and he was pointing it at nearby motorists. You could say at this point that Darrell Cloud was starting to become completely unhinged. On January 31st, 1994, Mr. Summers began his routine like he did every other day during the school year. This was the first day of a new semester at Whitman. Summers, who taught geography and history and special education at this point, had also taken on the duty of preparing Whitman's school schedules, making sure that class sizes and teacher assignments were balanced and appropriate. This is why Mr. Summers arrived at the school about an hour earlier than most of the other faculty members. Mr. Summers arrived at the school at roughly 6:30 a.m. that morning. As he exited his vehicle, he approached a side door to the school, one that's typically used by school staff and faculty members. It was then that a single shot from a high-powered rifle was fired into the back of Mr. Summers, who then collapsed onto the school's hallway floor. The weapon was so loud that some staff had called 911 because they thought there was an explosion or some kind of crash. Larry Temple, another teacher, had come out of his classroom, and it was there that he saw his wife, who was another teacher and Temple, attending to Mr. Summers. It was there he spoke his last words.
I heard an explosion. What was it?
Mr. Summers was then rushed to Harborview Medical Center. The assailant fled, and police began searching the building and the rooftop of the school. They began to scour the parking lot for shell casings and other evidence, and there were no eyewitnesses to the shooting. As students began arriving at the school, ready to start their new semester, they were led to a gathering in the school's auditorium. There, they were informed that a staff member had been shot. During their first period classes, Principal Caldwell announced over a closed-circuit television that the victim was Mr. Summers. During the second period, the principal made another announcement that Mr. Summers had died at 7:32 a.m., 1 hour after being shot. Homicide detectives were left with little to go on, so they began digging into Mr. Summers' own history. They interviewed friends, relatives, colleagues. At around 8:30 a.m. that morning, Daryl showed up at a friend's house wearing a camouflage jacket, black hat, black pants, and boots. Daryl had asked if he could hide a weapon in their home, but his friends smartly refused. About an hour after Daryl left, one of the friends had heard a radio report of a teacher being shot at Whitman Middle School. It was then that Daryl's friends suspected that the teacher was Mr. Summers, and if that were the case, the shooter was Daryl. The friends contacted the Seattle Times to get the name of the victim. When they were informed it was Neal Summers, the young men then contacted a relative in law enforcement and told them of their suspicions. That led the police to Daryl. After searching Neal Summers' home, they found Darrell Cloud's name on handwritten notes indicating a sexual relationship between Summers and Cloud, going all the way back to 1984. Police arrested Darrell Allen Cloud and recovered the weapon at a location separate from Darrell's residence. While digging into Mr. Summers' past, detectives began to uncover a lot more than what they were expecting to. Detectives began receiving reports of a sexually abusive relationship between Mr. Summers and Darrell Cloud. a relationship that had been ongoing for several years. This was corroborated by notes and documents that were seized by detectives in Neal Summers' home. Daryl's father, William Cloud, said his son never indicated he had any problems with the teacher, but said he learned that his son and other young men have had problems with Mr. Summers. In fact, while detectives dug further into Mr. Summers' past, it was revealed that Neal Summers had exhibited sexual deviancy towards minors at an early age. The earliest indication of trouble may have come from a woman who lived near Summers' home in the early 1960s, when Neal was about 15. Her 7-year-old son told her Neal Summers had twice masturbated in front of him in the basement of the Summers home. A year later, the woman said that her older son, about Neal's age, was visiting him in Summers' upstairs bedroom when Summers proposed that they masturbate together. He refused. The woman said that she told Summers' stepmother about it, but didn't inform the authorities because she figured Summers was just a confused adolescent. Now, details on the case and what occurred between Neal Summers and Darrell Cloud are scarce or sealed, but I was able to uncover some additional details. It was stated that Neal Summers had sexually abused Daryl for 10 years. It started in the following summer of 1982, when Daryl was only 13. Summers initiated sexual contact with him, which Daryl resisted. Summers persisted and eventually coerced Daryl into hundreds of incidents of sexual abuse, primarily by bribing Daryl and plying him with alcohol. Daryl eventually confessed to the murder. On the morning of January 31st, 1994, Darrell Allen Cloud waited in his car for Mr. Summers to arrive at Whitman Middle School. As Summers entered the school building, Cloud fatally shot him from a distance of approximately 150 feet. In the footnotes of the sealed case filed with the Court of Appeals of Washington versus Cloud, it states, "The record is replete with handwritten notes from Summers to Cloud, which support Cloud's allegations." As the trial prosecutor testified at a post-trial hearing, the evidence
was about as graphic as evidence could get in terms of documenting the types of abuse that Daryl suffered. The writings, the games that were part of his pattern of abuse, they were graphic, they were disgusting, and they were significant.
A planned memorial service for Neal Summers, otherwise known as Mr. Buddha, was hastily canceled. Darrell Allen Cloud pled not guilty to charges of first-degree murder of Neal Summers. Darrell Cloud sued the estate of Neal Summers, seeking unspecified damages, citing medical expenses and the plaintiff's past, present, and future pain and suffering.
I think that even though Summers is dead, he has to be held accountable, not only for what he did to Daryl, but to others,
said Alan Ressler, the attorney who filed the lawsuit. No other victims were named. However, documents introduced in court included a list of at least 20 victims and a questionnaire that Summers had Daryl fill out.
Am I taking advantage of you?
Summers asked.
Sort of.
Was the handwritten answer.
You make me pay for every drop of beer I drink.
But it doesn't end there. There is more. In March of 1995, after 12 hours of deliberation, Darrell Allen Cloud was found guilty of first-degree murder, rejecting Darrell Cloud's insanity defense. Daryl spent 9 years in prison for killing the monster Neal Summers, the well-respected and revered teacher who was valued amongst his peers, students, friends, and family. The pillar of the community who helped old ladies park their cars, and the child rapist who has had countless victims and left a devastating wake of damage in his path. Darrell Cloud was released from prison in 2003. Darrell Cloud also received a $250,000 settlement in a lawsuit against the Seattle School District, citing that they should have watched Mr. Summers more closely. The Seattle School District has never admitted liability. In the end, it took someone to become a monster, to kill a monster. Oh, but wait. I did say there were 2 monsters at the beginning of this episode, didn't I? Well, like I said, there's more. On April 5th, 2012, a woman named Candy Feely was dropped off at a hospital in Spokane, Washington. She was placed in a wheelchair, and a man handed a purse to a security guard. She was unconscious and had injuries to her face and bruises all over her body. The man that dropped her off stated Miss Feely was in a wedding brawl, and that he found her that morning shaking. After dropping off Miss Feely, the man immediately left and did not return. Doctors determined that Miss Feely had multiple facial fractures and bleeding on her brain that was life-threatening. Doctors performed surgery and believed the injuries to be trauma-induced. Through security tapes, it was determined that the male that dropped Miss Feely off at the hospital was none other than Darrell Cloud. When police contacted Daryl, he initially lied about his identity, and then he was immediately detained. When questioned, Daryl told police that Candy Feely was in a fight in Tacoma after her brother's wedding the previous Saturday, and that he thought she may have hit her head on a counter. Then he said she was in another fight in the Tuesday before arriving at the hospital, and supposedly during that fight was punched in the jaw, fell to the ground, and the attacker kicked her in the face repeatedly. However, when police interviewed Cloud's neighbors, they stated they had heard a very loud and potentially violent fight the evening of April 3rd, just 2 days before Feely was dropped off at the hospital. The fight ended with what was described as a loud thud. Feely's mother told police Cloud called her the same day her daughter was taken to the hospital. She said he had told her he found her on the floor, put her to bed, tried to give her liquids, but she was unresponsive. She then urged Cloud to take her daughter to the hospital. Candy Feely was in a coma for a month. About a month after her initial hospitalization, police interviewed Feely. Court documents said Feely couldn't speak after coming out of her coma, but was able to answer yes or no questions. She had previously told her mother Daryl had caused her injuries. When police asked her if Daryl was responsible, she said she was injured in Tacoma. Court documents show Cloud was previously arrested for domestic violence against Feely in 2009, but the case was dismissed. Feely died on July 29, 2016. According to court documents, the Spokane County medical examiner said the death was attributed to pneumonia due to complications from a subdural hemorrhage and brain contusion. Her manner of death was listed as a homicide. Darrell Cloud was charged with first-degree murder of Candy Feely. Daryl entered into an Alford plea for first-degree manslaughter. As part of a plea agreement, he will serve 8 years in prison, followed by 36 months of community custody. This story is a bit of a Greek tragedy, in a way. You have a kid who is faced with overwhelming adversity at an early age who is just looking for some stability and consistency. He had stupendous athletic abilities that could have taken him far in life. And then he is befriended by a scholar, a trusted adult who offered friendship and support. Sadly, this person ended up being the worst kind of monster. A child rapist who preyed upon vulnerable young men, and he paid the ultimate price for it. Rebecca Hurt, who was a former Whitman Middle School student who had attended one of the school trips to France with Mr. Summers, was an admirer of his. She also happened to be neighbors of Darrell Cloud, who used to babysit her as a kid. She was quoted as telling the Seattle Times,
"If Mr. Summers was here, I wish I could tell him I'm really sorry this has happened to him. On the other hand, I'd like to tell Daryl's family I hope everything turns out okay."
This quote was made after all of the information about Mr. Summers was revealed to the public. It's something I will never understand. There are people out there who choose to remember Mr. Summers for the good he did. They choose to view him as a revered teacher who impacted the lives of many young kids. Personally, I think the horrible atrocities he committed negates any good he could have done or be attributed with. He damaged these young men's lives. Some may have been able to move on, but some were damaged beyond all repair. These kinds of things have a lasting impact, and not just to those who are victims of such reprehensible behavior, but it can affect their families, their relationships, their marriages, the lives of their children. These kinds of things have a long-lasting rippling effect. And that is why I feel that no good deed or act that this monster can be attributed to should overshadow the absolute horror and damage he caused for 20 young men. The devastation left behind is almost insurmountable. While some of these young men have been able to grow and have productive lives, despite the mental and emotional fatigue after having lived through these events, some are likely not so fortunate. And for at least one that we know of, drove him to become a monster himself. While Neal Summers rots in the grave as memories of his contributions fade, Darrell Cloud will spend most of his life in prison. And the rest of the victims? Forced to live with these memories for the rest of their lives. Eventually, as time moves on, these events would fade into the past, and new generations would fill the halls of Whitman Middle School. Young kids with bright futures, hopes, and dreams. Some will move on to become doctors, lawyers, engineers, or popular social media influencers. Some will even move on to become star athletes and teachers. Whatever the future holds for many of these kids, there will always be a dark secret that will haunt the halls of Whitman Middle School. The terrible secrets of the scholar and the pupil. Secrets that the Seattle public school system would hope you'd soon forget. I assure you, it will never be forgotten. Thank you for listening to Season 1, Episode 6 of Just Another Monster. Now, I wanted to share a couple of announcements with you all. The Monster Mob, right? Is that where we're going with that one, I think? Season 1, Episode 7 will be out before the end of the month. Now, this case is very fitting for the upcoming holiday. It involves a Halloween party, a murder, numerous suspects, and you might have guessed it by now, my own connection to the case, and you won't want to miss that. Also, the first episode of Just Another Monster Blacklight will be released soon, so be sure to follow us on Instagram at A Monster Show or on Facebook at facebook.com Just Another Monster Podcast. If you follow us, you'll be the first to know when episode 1 of Blacklight is released. Again, thank you for listening. Take care of each other, and I'll see you next time.